Hello, and welcome to another Slumber story, read by me, Owen Staton. Today we have a little change of tone, as these stories are taken from the 1972 Dougal Annual. Dougal was a character from the Magic Roundabout, and all these stories were written by Jane Carruth. I loved the Magic Roundabout, and I'm sure, like me, you will be happy to revisit these happy tales of Dougal the dog. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath and prepare to enter the land of Nod, accompanied by happy characters from your childhood in this slumber story. Nosta. Rocket to Mars. Mr. McHenry was just putting the finishing touches to his greatest invention of all time when Dougal came along. "Ah, Dougal," said Mr. McHenry, "the very person I wanted to see. You shall be the first to admire my latest invention." "What is it?" Dougal asked. Mr. McHenry looked slightly offended. "What does it look like?" he asked. And Dougal, after a moment's thought, said, "It looks like one of those rocket things." "Exactly," exclaimed Mr. McHenry. "Dougal, my boy, you are now gazing upon a rocket of such power that it can land on Mars." "Really?" said Dougal. "Now if you had said the moon. But anyway, I've been there already." "Mars," said Mr. McHenry, with an air of importance, "is the most interesting of all the planets, because it is thought to be the most like Earth." "But it's a lot further away than the moon," Dougal retorted, not to be outdone, "so your rocket will have to work very hard to get there." "Have no fear," Mr. McHenry declared. "My rocket will get there, and it will carry one of us." "Which one?" Dougal asked, rather anxiously. "We shall see," replied Mr. McHenry. "We shall see." Dougal felt strangely ill at ease after his visit to Mr. McHenry. He went home, opened his sugar safe, and ate 10 lumps of sugar straight off. Then he lay down on his bed to work things out. Mr. McHenry meant for someone to go in his rocket to Mars. Who could it be? As he lay thinking, Brian came to see him. "Hello, old sport," said Brian, as he looked up at Dougal. "And congratulations, you really are a sport. What courage! What vision!" "I don't know what you're talking about," Dougal said, getting off the bed. "Come, come," said Brian, giving Dougal one of his sly looks. "All the magic garden is talking about it." "Talking about what?" Dougal asked. "Why, your flight to Mars," said Brian. "No need to be modest about it, old boy. We're all turning out in force tomorrow morning to see you blast off." "But that's rubbish," Dougal snapped. "I never said I was going to be the astronaut. I've done my share of gallivanting about in space." "That's just it," Brian said. When Mr. McHenry put it on to the vote this afternoon, we all said you should be the one to have the honour. There's no one who knows more about space and moonwalks. You're a hero, old boy, a true hero, and Florence thinks so too. She does she? Dougal said thoughtfully. Oh yes, Brian said, we all do. We are planning a big reception for you on your return, and Mr. Rusty is polishing up one of his war medals to give you. In spite of his fears, Dougal couldn't help puffing out his chest. Oh well, you did say a reception and a medal? Of course I did, said Brian. The whole magic garden is now being hung with flags in your honour. Well, I won't let you down, Dougal said gallantly. We know you won't, said Brian, and off he went. That night Dougal tossed and turned in his big bed, and he was glad to get up at the first light of day. He dressed with care, quite forgetting that his new bow tie would be hidden anyway by the spacesuit. When he arrived at Mr. McHenry's workshop, he found Mr. McHenry outside and the rocket on its launching pad. Mr. McHenry had set the control station under one of the trees, and Dougal's mouth opened wide and stayed open at the sight of all the dials and the levers. It's quite a business, you know, said Mr. McHenry after he had greeted Dougal. To land a dog on Mars. Yes, quite right, said Dougal nervously. He broke off quickly as Florence and Rosalie appeared, and then Brian, Dylan, and Mr. Rusty. Florence had a big Union Jack in her hand, and Mr. Rusty was wearing the shiny gold medal on his chest, meant for Dougal. Decorations of all kinds are hanging from the trees, and a large banner bearing the words, Dougal, our space hero, was strung out between poles. It's no use, Dougal thought to himself. With all this fuss, I'll have to go through with it. Without further ado, he allowed himself to be fitted into his spacesuit by Mr. McHenry, and to the cheers of the crowd, Dougal climbed into the rocket. Mr. McHenry stood at the controls. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Blast off. With a mighty explosion of noise, the rocket ship shot right into the sky as Mr. McHenry pressed buttons and pulled levers. Florence and the others watched anxiously, but it was a perfect takeoff, and soon the rocket was lost to view. Meanwhile, Dougal, like an astronaut born, was beginning to feel more excitement than fear as he worked the controls. As soon as he was in space, he made contact with Mr. McHenry on Earth and reported everything was just fine. Dougal's only fear now was that he would miss Mars altogether and land on the moon, which was, after all, old hat. But Dougal's luck was in all the way, and acting on instructions from ground control, he landed his rocket on a smooth greenish patch of what looked like watercress. Somewhat to his surprise, Dougal found that breathing was much easier on Mars than it had been on the moon. There was also a good deal of desert stretching beyond the green patches. Dougal said to himself, as he stared into the distance. I have the strangest, oddest feeling that I am not alone. All about him, apart from the green patches, was desert land, reddish in colour, yet strangely familiar, for Florence had once shown him pictures of a desert in Egypt. Greatly daring, he took a few floating steps away from his rocket, and almost at once tumbled headlong into a dust crater. Before he could right himself, Dougal suddenly realized that indeed he was not alone. Peering at him from around the rim of the crater were a half-dozen of the queerest-looking creatures he had ever seen in his life. Their faces were green in colour, their ears long and pointed, and their slit eyes reminded Dougal of Brian for some reason or another. Summoning all his courage, Dougal struggled to his feet and climbed out of the crater. He was set on immediately by those weird creatures who were, in fact, the Martians, the people of Mars. Dougal, as he lay pinned to the ground, saw out of the corner of his eye that 10 or more were now surrounding his rocket, whilst their friends were pinching and poking him. "I'm not staying," Dougal managed to get out, as he suddenly realized they meant to drag him away. "It was, only a flying visit, you might say." The leader of the Martians, who was bigger and taller than the others, indicated with a wave of his hand that Dougal should be allowed to rise, and Dougal suddenly remembered that Florence had once told him a story about a missionary who had won the hearts of cannibals with a few simple gifts, and he took heart. With slow, dignified steps, he made his way to the rocket, and as he went he dropped, can you guess? Sugar lumps, a supply of which he had in his spacesuit. The Martians fell upon the sugar lumps like starving children. At first they tossed them into space and watched them float like feathers. Then the Martian chief caught one in his mouth and crunched. It was lucky for Dougal that Martians have very sweet teeth. As soon as they saw their leader crunching and sucking, the other Martians began chasing after the sugar lumps, and Dougal was forgotten. With all possible speed, Dougal scrambled back into his rocket, closed the hatch door and blasted off. All in a matter of seconds. The last sight he had of the Martians was a strange one. The sugar had made them all stagger about like drunken men. "Come in, ground control," Dougal radioed as he zoomed through space. "Everything is just fine." Dougal's final splashdown was the talk of the magic garden for weeks and weeks afterwards. He was greeted by a fanfare of trumpets and organ music, flags waved, and Florence planted a kiss on his nose. Then, as Mr. McHenry stepped forward to pin the gold astronaut medal on his chest, Dougal said modestly, "Well, I must say it's nice to be back among friends. There's some odd people on Mars, I tell you, but at least I had something in common with them. Sugar lumps." And not another word would he say until he had eaten a few sugar lumps himself. Dougal's new kilt. Dougal was opening all his Christmas presents when Florence came to see him. "You should have waited, Dougal," Florence said. "It's not Christmas yet, and here you are beginning to open your presents." "I did the same last year," Dougal said, "and the year before. I always open my presents before Christmas." "Well, you shouldn't," Florence said. "We're all going to put our presents at the foot of the Christmas tree and then open them together." Said Dougal, struggling with a string round an interesting-looking package. "Well, I'll be different, that's all." Florence put the parcel she had been carrying down on Dougal's bed. "I suppose you'll open this after I've gone." "I expect I will," said Dougal shamelessly. "But thank you very much, Florence. You always wrap your present so much better than the others. Look at this one. It's got the wrapping paper on it that I used for last year, for Dylan's present." Florence smiled. "It's time you got the Christmas spirit, Dougal. I think I'll leave you." As soon as Florence had gone, Dougal began opening the present Florence had brought him. "I hope it's not one of those woolly vest things she's always wanting me to wear," he thought to himself, as he undid the string. To his immense delight and astonishment, it was not a woolly vest, but the most dashing kilt he had ever seen in his life. And to go with it, in the MacDougall tartan, was a smart Glengarry bonnet. Dougal said aloud. "Now this is something. I can't wait to put it on. What a figure I'm going to cut at the Christmas party." The other presents were forgotten as Dougal struggled with the kilt. Then he put on the bonnet. When he looked himself at the long mirror, he was so overcome by his noble appearance that he almost wished he could dash out straight away and show himself off. But Florence would never forgive me if I showed off her present before the party, he finally decided. So I'll just wear it home until the party tomorrow. Dougal spent the rest of Christmas Eve tidying away the paper and string and arranging his new presents in places where he could easily find them. He was so charmed with himself in his new kilt, however. When it was time for bed, he did not take it off. "I lie down in it," he decided, "but I won't go to sleep. I'll just have a quiet think." And he put his head on the pillow. But Dougal's head didn't stay there long. The loud, piercing note of the bagpipes roused him with such a start that he fell out of bed. Only it wasn't a proper bed at all. It was a heap of purple heather. With a swing of his kilt and his bonnet at a rakish angle, Dougal set out immediately to cross the small burn that divided himself from the rest of the MacDonald clan. Then at once the bagpiper gave his shrill call to arms. Chieftain MacDougall of the MacDougals put himself at the head of his clan and marched over the hill and into battle. The battle waged fast and furious as Chieftain MacDougall and his clan fought the redcoats and drove them farther and farther back over the heathered slopes. Dougal himself was always in the thick of it, and so too was the colonel of the redcoats, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with ears that stuck out from his head and a broad front teeth that were always bared in a cruel smile. At last, the two leaders met in a head-on clash. Chieftain MacDougall used his pike to knock the death-spitting musket out of the colonel's hand, and together they rolled down the purple hillock, locked in mortal battle. Cheered on by the MacDougals and encouraged by the pipes, Chieftain MacDougall fought with tooth and claw to overcome his enemy, and even when all seemed lost and the red coat was on top of him, he still fought on. Alas for the MacDougals. Thinking their chieftain faced certain death, they turned and fled. So the gallant chieftain was left without their support, and very soon he was captured. The red-coat soldiers tied him with ropes and led him behind the lines, where he was thrown into one of their tents. That night, the red-coat colonel came to offer Dougal a bowl of porridge and his life in return for information about the clan. The Scottish chieftain shook his head. "Never," he spat. "Take your porridge, laddie, and be gone. He who bears the noble name of MacDougall can never turn traitor." "Then starve, you Highland dog," snarled the angry colonel, baring his two front teeth. "I'll show you who the master is here." "I'll die with my kilt on, and the feather in my bonnet flying high," quoted the noble Highlander, as the furious colonel turned away. "You'll die by the musket," thundered the red-coat. "But first we'll strip you of that kilt." "Never, never, not that," MacDougall shouted. "Spare me my kilt." And he began to struggle desperately in an attempt to free himself from the ropes that held him bound. "Never, never." "Why, Dougal, whatever is the matter?" Florence cried in dismay as she rushed in to see Dougal. "We could hear you shouting all over the magic garden. And what are you doing here, dressed in your new kilt, and lying on the floor? What, where is he, the villain?" "Where's who?" Florence asked, as she helped Dougal to his feet. "It doesn't matter," said Dougal. "I was just engaged in this, Never mind, Florence. I must have been dreaming." "It sounds as if you are having a nightmare," said Florence, as she put the kettle on. "We were just putting our presents round the Christmas tree when we heard you shouting. Dylan guessed you'll be trying on the kilt, and he said—" He stopped suddenly. "What did Dylan say?" Dougal asked suspiciously, as she began making the tea. "Never mind, Dougal, darling. I won't tell him you fell asleep in your new kilt or anything." "Thank you, Florence," said Dougal. "Do you know, I rather wish now that I'd kept my presents until tomorrow." "Well, never mind," said Florence. "You look ever so handsome in your kilt, Dougal, and you can wear it the whole of Christmas Day." "That's one thing Dougal can never do," said Dougal with satisfaction, as he sipped his tea and crunched a sugar lump for extra comfort. "He can never, never wear a kilt, poor fellow. It's only true-born Highlanders that can do that." Dougal's piggy bank. "What is it?" Dougal asked Florence the day after the snowman competition. "It's my prize," said Florence, holding out the red and white spotted china pig. "It's a piggy bank. I love it." "A piggy bank?" Dougal exclaimed, in a puzzled kind of way, and he looked at the china pig with a slit in its back rather scornfully. It's just as well I didn't win the prize after all, if that's all it is." "I love piggy banks," Florence said, as she began peeling the potatoes for dinner. "Everybody should have a piggy bank." "Well, I haven't got one," said Dougal. And if I had, I wouldn't know what to do with it." "You put your money in it," said Florence. "That's how you save up for things." She shook the pig. "Listen, I've got 3 pence in it already." But Dougal pretended he wasn't interested, and after he had eaten 2 slices of Christmas cake and some sugar lumps, he said it was time he went home. On the way he met Paul and Basil. Paul was carrying a cricket bat and Basil had the stumps. "We were just going to have a game of cricket," said Paul, "now that it's stopped snowing." "I'm on my way home," said Dougal. "By the way, have either of you got piggy banks?" "Of course," said Basil. "We've both got piggy banks. I got this cricket bat by saving up for it. I just put some new pence in my piggy bank each week until I had enough to buy the bat." "I see," said Dougal, and he looked rather annoyed. "Well, I must be off." When he got home, he found Brian waiting for him. "I thought you wouldn't be long, old sport," said Brian, as Dougal came in. "I've been trying to guess what time it is, but your clock has stopped." "Nonsense," Dougal explained. "My clock never stops, and it always tells the right time." "Well, it has stopped now, old sport," said Brian. "And what's more, there isn't a single tick coming out of it. You'll have to start putting some money in your piggy bank and save up for a new one." "What did you say?" Dougal almost shouted. "Did you say piggy bank?" Brian looked at Dougal in surprise. "I say, old boy, do keep your shirt on. I mean hair. What's wrong with piggy banks?" "Have you got a piggy bank too?" Dougal demanded. And Brian nodded. "Yes, of course I have. A piggy bank helps you to save. Whenever I want a new hat or a scarf, I just go to my piggy bank. Yes, sir." Silently, Dougal jumped on his bed and studied his clock. Brian was right. The little hand pointed to 10 and the big hand to 6, and he knew it was more than 10:30. Besides, there was no nice loud ticks coming from it. "I was right about the clock," Brian said. "It must be nearly time for my dinner. I can tell by the empty feeling inside my house that I must give you the message." "Oh, very well," said Dougal in a cross way. "Then you can go. I want to do some thinking." "It's from Mr. Rusty," Brian went on. "He's given the magic roundabout train a new coat of red paint for the new year, and he wants you and the others to go down to the station and see it." He had not forgiven Mr. Rusty for giving the snowman prize to Florence. So now he said, "I'm sorry, Brian. I've got some important business. I can't come." Brian looked surprised at this, for Dougal, as a rule, liked going down to the station and putting on his engine driver's hat. But all he said was, "Very well, old boy. I'll tell him." After Brian had gone, Dougal jumped off the bed. First he went over to his sugar safe and took out 3 lumps of sugar, which he ate immediately. Then he began to tinker with his clock, and soon all the works and the spring were lying about the mat at the foot of his bed. "If only I had some money in my piggy bank," he caught himself thinking. "I could get a new one." Then he remembered he didn't have a piggy bank. Feeling strangely unhappy, Dougal wrapped his woolen scarf twice around his neck, then went off to Zebedee's house. Zebedee would almost certainly be able to tell him what to do about his clock. He might even have a spring he could lend. To his surprise, Zebedee was not at home. There was a note pinned on the garden gate, however, which said, "If you want me, I'm down the station." "Bother," Dougal said aloud. "What a nuisance. Now I'll have to go to the station, and Florence is sure to have told everybody I haven't got a piggy bank." The sound of Dylan playing his guitar reached Dougal's ears long before he reached the station, and this made him crosser than ever. If there was one thing he disliked more than most things, it was Dylan's guitar playing. When he arrived, Dougal saw that Mr. Rusty had decorated his station with little flags, and that the train was all freshly painted. "What's going on?" he asked Florence, raising his voice to drown Dylan's music. "Mr. Rusty wants us to see his newly painted train," Florence told him. "We're all going for a ride in it, just round and about. Then Zebedee has taken us back to his house for a party." On hearing his name, Zebedee suddenly popped up beside them, and Dougal got such a fright that he stepped backwards into one of Mr. Rusty's tins of red paint. "Never mind, Dougal," Florence whispered. "It's a lovely bright red." Dougal was so annoyed that he could hardly bring himself to tell Zebedee about his broken alarm clock. But in the end he did, and Zebedee said, "It sounds as if you'd better get a new one, Dougal. You'll have to rob your piggy bank to pay for it." "I haven't got a piggy bank," Dougal shouted, and completely losing his temper, he stumped away out of the station, up the little hill and through the magic garden he ran, leaving a trail of red paint behind him. "I do wish I had a piggy bank," he thought to himself when he got home. He felt more unhappy than cross. Then, after he had tried to wipe off some of the red paint, he jumped into bed, pulled the sheet right up to his long ears. In the morning, with no alarm clock to wake him, Dougal slept on, tossing and turning and dreaming about piggy banks. Hundreds of piggy banks, all different colours. They seemed to be dancing about all over his bed on their fat little legs. It was nearly 12 o'clock before Florence came to see him. Dougal was still in bed, looking very sorry for himself. "You don't look very well, Dougal," Florence said sympathetically, and she put a hand to his brow. "I think you've got a temperature." "I have not," Dougal said gruffly. "Go away." My, we are miserable this morning," Florence remarked cheerfully. "What's the matter, Dougal? Is it because your clock is broken and you haven't got a piggy bank of your own?" "Never mind," said Dougal, and closed his eyes. "I'll just go and get some of my cherry cough mixture," Florence said after a little while. "I won't be long." "You needn't bother," Dougal grunted ungraciously. "I won't drink it." When Florence came back, she had her basket with her. First she took it out and brought the cherry cough mixture, and Dougal muttered rudely, "You've just wasted your time bringing that stuff." And then she brought out a box of sugar lumps and a beautiful red and white spotted piggy bank. And Dougal's eyes widened as he sat up, as Florence went on. "The sugar lumps are from me, and the piggy bank is from Mr. Rusty. He's got a whole sack full, which he brought up from a jumble sale. Now open your mouth wide." "I won't," Dougal began. "Anyway, I feel much better." But Florence shook her head. "Open wide, Dougal." And Dougal did. After all, a spoonful of cough mixture was not a bad price to pay for a box of sugar lumps and a beautiful new piggy bank.